Greetings, fellow travellers aboard the Ark. Allow me to introduce you to the Sword M5. The who? The what? The Sword M what, where, which now, I hear you cry? Well, Sword were a small Japanese company who had done quite well in Japan selling machines for businesses in the 70s, and they branched out into home micros in the early 80s. And their angle was not dissimilar to what Commodore had in mind for the Commodore Max. A games computer taking on games consoles rather than a serious microcomputer for enthusiasts like something like the BBC Micro. So they were taking on the consoles with this machine, and they designed a machine that didn't even boot if you didn't have a cartridge in it. It had a cartridge slot there. If I was to power it on right now with no cartridge, it wouldn't even start up. The power light wouldn't even come on. You need a cartridge in it to make it boot up. So I will start up by putting the whole thing's quite well built. It's quite stylish looking. When you lift the flap to expose the cartridge slot, you've got this nice set of instructions that tell you about certain operations of the machine. If I put the basic cartridge in and power up, and there we go, we're into basic. I'm going to talk about this basic cartridge a bit later on as well. And so what I'll tell you about Sword, let me do the usual basic program. So Sword actually were founded by a chap called Takayoshi Shina. Takayoshi says hello. The keyboard's not terrible. Go to, has a bit of feedback on it, 10. Return and space being there in terms of the layout. My Spectrum muscle memory is having a bit of a crisis, but it's not too bad. Run. Takayoshi says hello. It wasn't just Takayoshi who founded Sword. Apparently he founded the company with his mum, and he was only in his mid-20s when they founded the company. I imagine board meetings were fun, probably consisted of her nagging him, clean up your office and get back here and finish your accounts before dinner. But they did well, as I say, and the machine they created was relatively impressive. Let me power up a game just to show you. I've got a nice multi-cart here featuring the delectable Uno. There we go. And what I'll do is I'll put real tennis on while turn the sound down because the beeping will get annoying. There we go. Yes. So the machine was probably, technically speaking, not that different to later MSX machines with the same sort of sprite capability. I think it was 32 monochrome sprites. It was relatively higher resolution for the time. You can see that those are not particularly jaggy pixels. It was, I would say, it's probably on a par with the TI-99 4A. You could pull stunts with your sprites to give the illusion of multicolour sprites. So they're probably, I suspect, what they're doing here on this tennis game is the bat is a sprite and the player is another sprite, so that's how they can overlay the bat on top of the player there. And so, yes, in theory, it was a decent technical platform. The problem, they only baked in 4K of RAM, and they didn't perceive that as a problem because games are going to be cartridge-based. The game program wouldn't fill up the RAM, it would run directly from cartridge. It would only need the RAM in order to store game data, scores, positions of players and so on. Sword showcased the machine in October in the UK, in October 1982, after it had been out in Japan for a month or so. And they declared it would be £150 and it would come out the following month. That would have been November 1982. No sign of the machine by mid-December. They pushed the launch date back to February the following year. And then but by March 1983, there was still no sign of it. And then Essex-based Computer Games Limited, CGL, signed a distribution deal with Sword. And you can see my Sword, my M5, is actually CGL branded. The Sword ones were in quite lurid colours, where mine is kind of this greyy, kind of battleship beigey grey colour. The actual Sword M5s are lurid yellow in, you know, instead of this colour. They retain the blue for the keyboard area, but the actual colour here and there is lurid yellow in the actual Sword branded versions of the M5. CGL had been quite successful importing Japanese handheld LCD games, and they saw the M5 as their route into the British home computing market. But there was still no UK release for months and months. They eventually made a public appearance in May '83 at the Midland Computer Fair, and the response was lukewarm. The lack of RAM was described as a very serious crime indeed by Personal Computer World, you know, up there with, you know, the Great Train Robbery. And elsewhere it reviewed well. They particularly admired the graphical capabilities. Let's put some different games on to showcase some of those graphical abilities. Let's put on some games we'll know. I'll do Galax, which is a clone of Galaga. Let's turn the sound up. We want the nice music. So yes, this version of Galaga actually reminds me of the MSX one, to be fair. I'm trying to get myself captured so I can get an extra shot. But you know, you can see the actual sprites move around quite nicely. They are single coloured. Oh, here we go, here we go, here we go, here we go. Be careful I don't shoot my own ship now. I'm not sure if Galaga was the first game to actually have power-ups. Yeah, otherwise... Okay, I'm going to stop playing Galaga now because it is one of my favourites. What else have we got? Let's take a look at Moon Patrol, which is another game that was across a number of platforms. And there's versions for the Atari machines and the 64. It was quite a popular game. One player. It reminds me of the MSX version. Single colour graphics, but they're not as blocky. They're nowhere near as blocky as something, say, the Commodore 64. You know, in many respects, you know, it's like a Spectrum. The graphic capability is like a Spectrum, but with sprites. So your sprites don't suffer from attribute clash because they're above and beyond the actual standard graphic hardware, and that was a shortcoming of the Spectrum, really. So yes, it's a pretty decent implementation of Moon Patrol. We've got the dink dink beep 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 music. Oops. And let's do. I'm going to put on one last game. I'll put on. There's an interesting game called Up Balloon, which I haven't quite figured out how to play. But what I think they're stretching the hardware quite. Well, in terms of, there must be a lot of sprites going in there to make up that sprite. It's kind of hard to, I haven't got a joystick interface for it, so the keys are pretty terrible. I think I'm supposed to grab those hearts. But the sprite's great. They're obviously doing a bit of multiplexing because it's quite flickery. Oh. Oh. I'm not quite sure how I... Oh, that kills me. Yeah, okay. Let's put tennis back on so we've got something to look at while I talk. So, what happened? They eventually got the M5 to market in the UK in June '83. And it was bundled with Basic I as the basic cartridge. And Sword actually released several flavours of Basic. As Basic I, Basic F and Basic G. But the bundled cartridge was integer maths only and provided no access to the graphical capabilities of the machine, which is a shame because it had some quite good graphical capabilities. If you wanted access to the graphics or floating point maths, you had to fork out for another cartridge. I've got Basic G on my multi-carts, I think. Yes, 6 Basic G. It looks exactly like Basic I, but there are graphical commands, which I'm afraid I don't know, so I'm not going to write any programs for it. And when it was released, no one really bothered. And the reason for that is partly because of the actual marketplace. We never quite had the price wars of the American market, but by July 1983, all the mainstays of the British market, like Commodore and Sinclair, Oric, you know, the machines that were popular in the UK, had cut their prices. But something else in the UK market was that we were very RAM oriented in terms of marketing. And the 4K on the M5 was a showstopper. The British market, our advertising for computers, massive memory, 48K, 64K. And it meant the M5 was much less appealing in the marketplace than the more commonplace Spectrums and even the, Dragon 32s and Oryx that a lot of British punters were buying. And then back in Japan, the MSX has come onto the market, and that was eating the M5's lunch. Similarly capable, but it was backed by big companies, and it was it was something of a standard. A lot more companies were supporting it in terms of software, and they were also back in Japan. Sword was struggling with something of a dirty tricks campaign against them by a larger, more established Japanese company. They started spreading rumours that Sword were in financial trouble, and it worked. People stopped delivering parts and components to Sword because the manufacturers thought, we're not going to get paid. We're not going to supply these guys. And leasing companies stopped actually extending credit to Sword's customers. And they were bought by Toshiba in the end, although Takayoshi Shina went to great pains in later years to say that Tosh weren't involved in that dirty tricks campaign that ultimately scuppered Sword as its own entity. CGL continued to sell their own brand M5, but it never ever really rose very high. I think it peaked at 15th place in the tables of the best-selling British micros. I mean, even the appalling Mattel Aquarius got to 13th at one point. And by the end, CGL were flogging off stock of the M5 under 50 quid. And it's a sad story that gets repeated very often in computing history. You've got a small company, goes up against the big boys with an objectively decent product. We might consider Sword to be like the Japanese Memotech in some respects, or the M5 is like the Japanese Enterprise. They just couldn't make inroads against the established names, even though they might have had a objectively better product in certain ways. They found their hopes and dreams crushed by those inevitable market forces. But it is easy to see in hindsight how it didn't work in the UK. That 4K RAM was never ever going to appeal to the British market. And we weren't console oriented. We'd already shifted to computers for games by then. You know, in the early 80s, 82, 83. Everyone had computers, home micros to play games on. Everyone's playing games on their Spectrums and 64s. RAM size had become a synonym for how powerful a computer was. They never really looked at graphical capabilities. They just said 48K RAM better than 16K RAM. I remember telling my friends in the playground at school their BBC Micro was rubbish because it only had 32K and my Spectrum had 48K. Specky therefore better. So maybe missed a marketing trick. Maybe they could have declared the machine had 20K of RAM. It actually had 16K of video RAM in order to run the high resolution screen and the sprites. And they could have maybe kicked that 4K up to 16K. Add the two, you know, 16K of video RAM, 16K of regular RAM, 32K total. Would have at least made it competitive with the Dragon 32 and BBC Micro. But hindsight's 2020. Unfortunately, my TARDIS is in the repair shop right now. So I can't go back and pull the sword from the stone. Yeah, it's a terrible pun. I'll get my coat. But somewhere in a parallel universe, a couple of universes to the right of us, we've got modern recreations of the M5 made by Retro Games Limited, selling out a day after they're first released on Amazon. In that universe, the Sword Next is on its third Kickstarter campaign and blazes past its funding goal in 7 minutes. People of a certain age range, old fogies like me and many people watching this video, get all misty-eyed when they think of the M5 in that other universe. But this is not that universe. Instead, we, in our universe, shed a tear and lament Takayoshi Shina's dream and his mum's dream. The Sword M5. Gone, and unfortunately, largely forgotten.